Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome. We're excited to have you here tonight. We are republicEn, and this is the webinar, New Year's Resolution, Making Progress Amidst Division, with our special guests, Sarah Stewart Holland and Beth Silvers from Pantsuit Politics. My name is Angela, and I am republicEn's Engagement Director. Just a real quick walkthrough of tonight's event. We're going to have a quick orientation and welcome, our wonderful speaker presentation, and then plenty of time for audience Q&A. So we're going to keep everyone on mute. Please type questions and comments in the chat. We are going to be keeping an eye on those and filtering those to Beth and Sarah. And so our goal is to get everybody's answers and comments out there to them and get them in as part of the discussion. And so now I am going to turn the mic over to republicEn's Executive Director and former Congressman Bob Inglis, and he is going to tell you a little bit more about our organization. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Angela, and we're very excited to have Beth and Sarah with us tonight, so thank you for that and for all of you joining us. So republicEn.org, it's a growing group of conservatives who care about climate change. And as you just saw in that slide that Angela up, we say, if you're a conservative and you care about climate change, you're among the most important people in the world because you're needed for action. And so welcome. If this is your first time with us, please, you'll have opportunities in your inbox to continue to and get involved with things that we're doing. We need you because we want to make you audible and visible to your members of Congress and to your senators. Because once you become visible and audible, they'll decide there's a constituency to lead. And so we're in the business of developing that constituency. So welcome and thank you for joining us, and off to Sarah and Beth.
Actually, off to me first.
Oh.
Bob, you're not following the agenda. Welcome, everyone. I'm Chelsea Henderson. I am the Director of Editorial Content at republicEn, and I also am the host of our podcast, The Eco Right Speaks. And I was the advocate for bringing Sarah and Beth on the show. So it is my absolute greatest pleasure to introduce them to you. They are my favorite podcasters. Sarah and Beth together co-host Pantsuit Politics, which is the first podcast that I really started to listen to on a regular basis. And what I love about their show is that they really prioritize curiosity and the inquiry over some of the issues that we go head to head over, that we're conflicted about, that's really, kind of in the public mind in the current news. So I really thought that they would be wonderful for this audience, many of whom are either conservatives trying to figure out how to enter the conversation on climate change, or there's somebody who might know conservatives and they want to know how to talk to those conservatives about climate change. And as I think most people in this webinar will understand, this is an issue that has just really grown a little bit more divisive and partisan over time. Sarah and Beth just have such a respectful and nuanced way of discussing the hot button issues of the day that when I listen to their show, I always find myself learning a thoughtful approach or a thought-provoking idea that I carry with me. So I hope that you will walk away feeling the same way. In addition to hosting their wonderful podcast, Sarah and Beth are also authors of 2 books, I Think You're Wrong, But I'm Listening, and Now What? And I just have to share, Sarah and Beth, I know that you have heard this from other listeners, but I feel like we're friends in real life, to the point where one of my best friends who is on the webinar today, when she and I are talking about your show, we'll say, oh, did you hear what Sarah said about X, Y, and Z? Or did you catch Beth's take about X? And we have other friends that are like, wait, who's Sarah? Who's Beth? And they think that we're talking about other friends from a different social circle. So how embedded you are in my life, in my daily way of thinking. And so participants, without further ado, I'm going to turn the show over to Beth Silvers and Sarah Stewart Holland.
Thank you so much. That was super kind introduction, Chelsea. We really appreciate it. And we're so excited to be here. We had the privilege of having Bob on our show several years ago now, when we were still introducing ourselves as Sarah from the left and Beth from the right, which will give you a little bit of introduction to our political leanings. I was a Republican until 2019. And as the world shifted, and particularly as I watched local candidates here in Kentucky shift on the issues, I decided to change my party registration. We're a closed primary state here in Kentucky, so registering as an independent doesn't do you a lot of good. So we now are both registered Democrats, but we do have really different perspectives on how government functions. And we've summarized those for many years now, and I think most accurately by talking about ourselves as sort of the accelerator and the brakes. When we think about really big problems, Sarah wants to bring the full power of the federal government to solving those problems. She's the accelerator. I'm the brake, saying, hey, we've got to think about the consequences when the federal government enters an arena and how difficult it is to adapt and shift. And then when we talk about the private sector, I'm the accelerator. I get really excited about private solutions to big problems. And Sarah acts as the brakes and says things like, hey, let's talk about Facebook for a second. Let's talk about Lehman Brothers. Like, there are lots of examples of the private sector going unchecked that we don't like either. And what we really have learned over 7 years of conversation with one another is that you do need both of those in the car. And you can't go anywhere if you're slamming them both down at one time. And so there has to be a little bit of give and take. And that's part of what I really love about republicEn and the work that you do. You say we need both perspectives at the table around a problem like climate that is so big and so daunting, and that you're not going to have progress if you're only taking one approach. If you're only slamming down one of those operators, you're not going to get anywhere. So we are just so delighted to be here.
Now, the topic for tonight is difficult conversations. And we do want to spend some time on difficult conversations inside the conservative community. But I want to say, you guys, I live with a nihilistic 13-year-old who gets most of his information from YouTube. So I can tell you about difficult conversations around climate from a different perspective. Do you understand what I'm saying? He thinks he's right, and he thinks all is lost. And so we've been spending a lot of time recently talking about how the climate paradigm is shifting because of the investment from the federal government. That now, you're talking about climate activists that have waited for legislation for most of their lives that has now passed. Now we're going to be in this building, this scaling, this new phase. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges with this conversation, is because when it is so big and it has absorbed so much of our political energy, when the reality shifts, it takes a while for the conversation to catch up. You even see, we're doing that in a lot of ways in the United States. Reproductive rights is another place where things are shifting and the conversation is trying to catch up because the reality has changed so dramatically. And so I think that just observing that and acknowledging that this is a place where the conversations get stuck in time. But this is the reality is that the pace of change, particularly when it comes to renewable energy and technology, that pace of change is so fast. And so I think that's some of the pressure we can feel inside these conversations, especially if you are absorbed in this space and you understand how quickly the pace of change is going, is that the conversations get a little stuck in time.
And all of that shifting can be daunting, but it's also opportunity making. I was thinking about Bob's comments at the beginning about creating a constituency for conservatives in Congress. It is the Wild West for conservatives in Congress right now, right? This narrow majority in the House of Representatives, a midterm election that went quite differently than Republicans expected it to 9-10 months ago, coming into another presidential cycle where it looks like you're going to have a very big, crowded Republican primary, that's an opportunity for people to find new motivators and new stakes and new constituencies. And hopefully a time when if you have a conservative community that says, we really want action on climate, we really want an understanding, we want our political leaders to be conversant in climate issues, we want to be participants in the international community and efforts in the international community to combat climate change cooperatively. I think that shifting landscape opens doors that might have felt stuck previously.
Well, we also want to acknowledge, like, this is a very hopeful perspective. This is a hopeful paradigm. We're talking about shifting technologies and shifting, acceleration when it comes to renewable energies. But the other place that this is changing the conversation is with extreme weather. And that's less of a hopeful place to be in. That's a place of great trauma, depending on what your community has experienced. That's a place of enormous emotional involvement. And so I think it's easy, if you are concerned about the climate and you're looking for it, like if you're a conservative and you want to talk about climate and you're looking for an open door, it's easy to think, well, now you've experienced this extreme climate environment and now you get it, right? Like now you get it, you're on board. And I think we have to be really careful when we're trying to take these opportunities and these difficult conversations to acknowledge that, not only are those experiences difficult, but everyone experiences them differently. And I do think that extreme weather is moving the needle, absolutely, in a macro level. I just think inside these conversations, we have to be really careful. I do think that, to the polarization inside the United States, we actually often use those natural disasters to work on that, to say, like, in those moments, no one's asking for party identification. So if you're looking for some space inside the conversation around the partisanship that so often comes to the table with climate change, extreme weather events and people's experience in them can open up that little path into the humanity and the acknowledgement that in so many ways we are in this together. I just think that, again, that's a very careful path we have to take, because there is so much tied up in people's experiences with tornadoes or flooding or, whatever the extreme weather we're talking about.
And extreme weather is an interesting example of how we just get stuck in language, because I have a different conversation when I approach people to discuss extreme weather events versus starting with climate change. There's been a really interesting series of essays. I think it's from the Liberal Patriot. I subscribe to too many newsletters and I get lost about who said what, but they've been tracking the evolution of first conservation, then environmentalism, then climate change, and now sort of what they're framing as climate catastrophe from the Democratic side of the aisle, and what language has been really constructive and what language has been really destructive. And so something that Sarah and I talk about in our books and on our show, and that we just practice in our lives, because we both live in areas that are traditionally fairly conservative. I mean, Kentucky is not a purple state in the Electoral College, So we really try to think about, who am I talking with and what language is going to be an obstacle to us connecting over this issue. One of the things I loved when we had Bob on our show was discussing this through a spiritual lens and talking about where is the redemption for us when we discuss climate change. I think about that part of our conversation often. My pastor just gave a sermon this past Sunday about Sabbath as an act of environmental care. And it was a really beautiful perspective that I think touched people in a different way than they've been touched before on this topic. And so just being super flexible in our language and in the solutions that we're willing to entertain and asking some new questions, I do feel like we're in a moment where there's a little bit of softness and a little bit of opportunity to break through, if you will focus in on exactly who you're talking with and what baggage they're carrying into that discussion.
I wanted to address Jeffrey's question. I wasn't just talking about Build Back Better. I was absolutely talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, which is so confusingly named because it really is once in a generation climate change legislation. But that's okay. I don't care what they had to do to get Joe Manchin's vote. And I think that sense of, well, is it enough? This is what I encounter with my 13-year-old son. Will it even matter? Yes, of course it will. Of course it will matter. And I think keeping that hopeful bent, and I think honestly, one of the best answers I've ever heard about this was from Ezra Klein, who was actually answering the question, like, is it environmentally irresponsible to have children? Because I think younger generations really battle with that climate nihilism is what I call it. And he had a great conversation about this, like really playing out both the ethics of that and also that climate is in a new place, but the conversation is stuck. The conversation is stuck, and the way people feel about climate change, it's almost like, as we often do in America, we think a new word will reset the conversation. I'm not actually arguing that, but I do sometimes think some new language, that we're in this building phase, that we're in this investment phase, that we're scaling up, would help people start to move around inside the conversation a little bit, instead of getting stuck in like, we're not doing enough, it's never going to be enough, the end. Or the opposite end of the difficult conversation we have, which is, does it matter? There's no such thing as climate change. This is just an invention of the left, or whatever the case may be. And I think, when we can find some flexibility, just because you need so little, not to convince someone to join your side, but to just open up that path to influence. That's what we talk a lot about on our podcast, is that we are not trying to convince people. We are trying to influence people. And influence is a long game. It's not one conversation. It's building trust. It's laying that foundation. It's, sharing stories. It's lots and lots of listening. There's a great phrase in Adam Grant's Think Again, where they interview a physician who they call the vaccine whisperer, who often will convince people who are skeptical about vaccines to vaccinate their children. And I think they call it motivational listening. And it's giving that, it's almost back to what Beth was saying about that sort of redemptive quality, which is giving the speaker the benefit of the doubt. Like, if you approach a climate conversation with someone who is on the all the way on the other end, that it's an invention of the left, and you don't believe that you don't give them the benefit of the doubt that, like, they also want what's best for future generations, and they also care about our planet. Like, you just have to have some underpinning there that, like, they believe those things. It's manifesting differently for them. And I think, but if you approach the conversation with, we love to listen in American politics in difficult conversations, we love to default right to, you don't care if everybody dies. I don't know why that is our default in position, but we love it. We love to hang out there. You don't care if everybody dies. Whatever the conversation, that's where it ends up. You don't care if everybody dies. Not a great place to influence someone. Not a great place inside a conversation to try to influence someone.
And I think that gets to what I might share with Alex, who is in this lucky position of having a senator, he says, who works well in a bipartisan way, who believes the climate change is real, who is open to some federal action on climate change, but is not open to carbon fee and dividend, for example. I think, that's a place where you could really have a nice, like, brainstorming conversation with someone. And I would offer that up. Hey, I so appreciate these things about you. This is something I really want to discuss with you or someone in your office, because I think that we need to look at the incentives for all actors from all sides of this discussion. And we need carrots and sticks here. And here's what I see that you've been willing to do that provides this incentive to this party or this subsidy to this industry. But I really think we're missing this piece of the picture, and here's why. And that doesn't mean that everyone comes around to it, but maybe you give them new language and new questions to ask as they're having meetings. This is a very long game to get any kind of legislation enacted. And you all know this, you're on the ground working for that all the time. So anytime you can plant a new seed, it's amazing hosting a podcast, coming to understand that if you give someone a phrase that they carry off into a context that you never imagined when you said the phrase, it can really be transformative. And so just having those meetings and maybe incentive is the way to phrase this. I don't think that we've set up all the right incentives yet, and I'd like to talk with you about it. That might down the road lead them into a conversation that they've not had before.
I love Kyle's comment, because I have had this exact exchange with my father, who lives in California and who is all the way on the other end of the political spectrum from me, about poor management. And it is so hard, even though I do this for a living, it is so hard for me in those moments to just concede the point and go, yeah, you're right. Part of the issue is poor forest management. You're right. You're right. Some of this is, some of climate issue is housing policy. And some of that, wrapping back around in a circle, is driven by environmental policies that were meant to protect environments. And now they're used to slow down development. You know, like there's just this circle of difficulty when you come to a climate conversation. And I think in any conversation about any policy I disagree with, whether it's climate or otherwise, it is like physically difficult for me to just stop and be like, wait, I can see that point. I can see that point. Nothing is lost for me for saying, you're right, that is something different. But we can acknowledge that. We can acknowledge that there has been this thing, and that's not the only thing at work here. We know there's always a lot of different factors, but when you see that point, you build trust. And I think that's so hard to remember in the moment when you feel defensive, is that when you, and I even see the point is maybe too aggressive of a language. It's like still plays on our ego. But when you just acknowledge the truth in someone else's argument or perspective, you build trust. But I think in those moments when we're defensive, it feels like we're losing something.
In addition to conceding a point, I think conceding like the goodness on the other side of the table from you in these conversations is important. This gets to the question about talking about jobs and the economy and the fear that we feel when we start talking about renewable energy versus fossil fuels. And what does that do? You know, we live in a coal state. What happens to people who are working in these industries? Conceding the goodness of that position doesn't cost you anything in the discussion either. And identifying for people, you know what, what's really challenging here is that we have to work on several timelines at once. And I can see that your heart is really in the present for these people who don't know another trade, who might not have an economic opportunity where they live. And that is legitimate and that's important. And I want to problem solve with you on that. And I also want you to problem solve with me on this longer timeline. And we have a responsibility to both the present and the future. We also have here in the present a number of disasters that we've not combated before. And so I think that if we partner together with our concerns for these different timelines, we can make some progress. Just saying, I don't see you as an enemy here. I see you as a partner who's focused on a different aspect of the problem than I am, and that's valuable. That is where conflict becomes really valuable, when you're able to say, there is legitimacy in your position and in mine, and surely together we can find a path forward that takes both of those concerns into consideration, with some give and take always. It kind of goes back to the gas and the brakes, right? You can't slam them both down at the same time. There will be some tension in these positions, but it can just be the tension that has value, and we can find a way through that.
Well, and listen, does everybody want to talk about gas stoves? I bet you did, because that's what we're all fighting about right now, is gas stoves. My husband came home today for dinner, and I was like, I guess if we're going to keep our Democrat car, we're going to have to get us an induction stove, because right now we have a gas stove. They're going to let us stay. And you know, it's like so easy to just laugh and roll your eyes. But I really took a moment today, and I'm like, why does this stuff work? Why do the light bulbs and the low flush toilets and the gas stoves, like, why does this set a certain subset of the population's hair on fire? And I have to remind myself that, you know, the other sticky, dangerous ground of climate conversations is that climate change, it's right there in the name, accelerates change. It is accelerating the path of technological change, which is a source of stress. It is accelerating the path of extreme weather, which again is another, you know, massive amount of change to people's lives. And that pace of change, the amount of change, just makes some people's, I like change, I love it, but some people, it stresses them all the way out. And it, you know, when someone is feeling in fear and in scarcity because of so much change around them, they cannot do higher level processing, right? They're stuck there. And they're very susceptible to sort of tribal, they're the enemy thinking. So you can see this, you know, you can see this river that's so easy to step into and be swept along. And then all of a sudden it is a big deal that somebody wants to take your gas stove away. you already took my light bulbs and gave me 50 options when really I just want a light bulb. You know, like you can just see this stress and this just undercurrent of frustration with where climate change is taking us and how dealing with climate is going to contain even more change and like that. And I just have to give grace for that. It stresses me out too. I would also like less options for light bulbs. I'm just being honest right now. I would like to go to Lowe's and have fewer options when I want to replace a light bulb. I find it stressful. And so like, I have to remember to give grace for that we are saying, when we're saying this is a big deal, we have to remember in our minds, yeah, it's a big deal. And that's stressful for people. And for people who already have an enormous amount of stress or burden, economic or otherwise, who knows what's going on in their lives, like that higher level processing is just going to get shut down, and it's going to be in a very emotional place they're in.
And like, here's my somewhat partisan suggestion. Like, the gas stove is an opportunity for conservatives who want to bring climate solutions to the table, right? Sometimes you got to beat on the other team a little bit to get your team to propel forward on an issue. Mm-hmm. So here's a place where you can say, listen, Democrats want you to do the electric stove and the paper straw, and they want you to put it all on your shoulders. And we're saying, as Kyle is in my brain here, we're saying we need a collective approach to this, where market actors who are doing the most damage are taking on the most risk for that damage and are incentivized to do the most good in this area. So I'm not here to make you feel guilty and terrible and to beat up on you about your individual choices, because your individual choices only affect the teeniest piece of a massive puzzle. And I want to do the thing that gets to the massive puzzle.
And as a good Democrat, I would come in and say, we also want to relieve the individual pressure about just, instead of using the market, is using the government. This is the gas and the brakes that we're always talking about, right? Like, but I do think that individual prism that we force almost every conversation through in the great United States of America, it's okay. We're doing better about some things, but we love to just think about our individual actions and what we can control. And I think that's the other challenge of climate conversations, is especially inside a conservative community, like inside of the conservative community that is sort of, has that foundation of individualism and deregulation and stay away. Like when we need a community solution, when we need to have at least a community conversation about a market solution, then that's just a whole nother layer of difficulty that you're layering onto the conversation. And naming those is okay. Naming all of that, observing it and then naming it is okay. That will grease the gears of the conversation. You think when you're being vulnerable and you're saying, I don't really know how to respond to that feels so scary that it's going to shut the conversation down. And almost every time it propels it forward. Because when you acknowledge, like, I don't know the answers to all this, I just know that I care about the problem. Or I think I have this solution that will work really well, but we're going to have to try something. Can we agree on a path forward at all? And look, the truth is, inside some of these conversations, you don't have to write draft legislation. You don't have to come to an agreement at all. What you're trying to do is open up that civic dialogue, because it feels pointless. Like, what does it really matter if I'm having this civic dialogue with someone who disagrees with me? But it does matter. It all builds on each other. And you have a conversation and they build some trust. And then the next time they see something, they click a link and they're just a little bit more convinced. And it builds and it builds and it builds.
So you can tell that we're watching the chat. We love being in conversation. That is our favorite thing. So please come into the chat, be in conversation with us. We'd love to hear about specific experiences that you have when you talk with other people about these issues, specific places that you get stuck. I just wanted to offer up while I'm giving you a second to type. To that point that Sarah was just making, I find that one of the most effective things I can do in a discussion about climate with someone, because people like to make a lot of assumptions. We drive an electric car and we have solar panels, right? And so a lot of people in our lives have decided that we must believe that they're bad humans if they have a car that uses gas or if they don't have solar panels. And so when someone says to me, like, well, you probably think everybody should have an electric car, I will say, I absolutely do not believe that, because we are not equipped for everybody to have an electric car right now. I worry about our grid. all the time. And if you had an electric car and everybody in our street had an electric car, I would be really, really concerned about that. And it just like earns some credibility. It's again, kind of back to that seeding the point, but even just walking in their direction a little bit. I really care about the bigger picture here. And I don't have an electric car just because I want to be like a moralizing person who believes I'm better than everyone. I think it's neat. I'm interested in the technology. We're early adopters on lots of things in my house. And as this turns more, I want to be able to share my experience. But no, I don't think I have a solution that's appropriate for everyone. And anytime you can give a little bit of that ground, it really does open a lot of doors.
Well, and I would imagine electric vehicles are a great place inside these difficult conversations to talk about the market. Do you think that Ford is doing woke charity with the Lightning? No, they're doing it because there's demand and they anticipate making a large amount of money. That's why they're doing it. And Godspeed to them. I want one. Like, I think that that's a great, like the proliferation. What is it, like 2 of the 3 cars of the year last year were electric? Like, this isn't about everybody just trying to do the right thing. Like, is that what you think the car industry is in the business of doing? No, they're in the business of making money. They're in the business of seeing like, this is the solution. This is the path forward. And I think as more as you see that in a corporate space, that'll offer more avenues inside the conversation to influence, to point to, look, this is where we're going. Like, this is you can see the market signals already everywhere. We're past signals. These are like full on flashy lights. And I think that that's a really good way to like open up another path of the conversation and say, like, this isn't just about like the government forcing us to do something and inventing, an issue. Like, if Ford is creating an F-150 that can power your house in an outage.
I really appreciate Eleanor's comment. And I just want to say, if you aren't watching the chat, she's sharing that that she loves this book, How to Change Minds, because it talks about how this is a long exercise when you're trying to convince someone to change their position. And what Sarah and I talk about a lot, whether it's on climate or any other issue, if we want to have influence over other people, we must allow them to influence us too. And so the goal in any conversation is not to convince anyone or change their mind, or as Sarah said, bring them around to endorsing this candidate with me. It's just to build the relationship a little bit more so that more of that influence is possible. And it must be reciprocal. Like, we just can't take on other people as projects. That is a recipe for really unproductive conflict. If we want to stay in that productive conflict zone, then the goal of each discussion that we have with someone really just needs to be like, how do we continue to build this relationship so that at some point something I say can really connect with them. And at some point, I can really be affected by them too.
Jeffrey, when I say that I have so many wishes when it comes to Elon Musk, you wouldn't even believe. But yeah, that's one of them. I mean, look, Tesla wasn't going to monopolize this marketplace forever. It was inevitable, whatever hijinks Elon Musk was up to. And that's good. That's what we want, right? We want a robust marketplace for electric vehicles, and that's what we're going to get. How Tesla sinks or swims on the other side of that is up to their leadership, and I should hope they have leadership beyond Elon Musk. I think they definitely will if he keeps his hijinks up.
I think Kyle's question is really interesting, that we need some civility in like bringing conservatives to the conversation, but we also need an incentive for them to be at the table. And that's where I think being a constituency for conservatives who bring climate solutions forward is really important. And also just convincing them that anytime they sit an issue out, they don't like the results. If Democrats own the conversation around climate change, then when they have the opportunity to legislate, they're going to keep doing really big things that are not easily undone. And if those are not the solutions to this problem that you think are going to be most effective, why would you want them legislating in that field alone? You could point to lots of recent examples of issues that Republicans have just set out because they want to deny the problem instead of bringing a solution forward. And so I think appealing to that sense, like you need to be at the table. And in this Congress, there is a real opportunity to be at the table. So take it.
Yeah. I love this Bill McKibben quote that Gwen and Doug shared. I think it's so true. I think I heard him say something very similar on a podcast line. And I think that it's, look, this is the other inherent challenge. It's very, very technical. All these conversations around solar and wind power and batteries and the electrification. And now we're going to start talking about nuclear fusion, which, despite the fact that Marvel has done its best, I am not an expert on. And so you just have all these technical areas that come to play that it's hard. And like, then everybody starts talking like they're an expert or a scientist, and they're not. But we're all invested. We're all citizens, which makes us important inside the conversation. But there is this enormous knowledge gap that people often even don't know they have. Because everybody's like, I plug things in, I experience the weather, I'm an expert on climate change. I drive a car, that makes me an expert. I have a gas stove. And so I think that's another thing to observe and acknowledge. Like, you're having these conversations and you feel like, I'm going down this rabbit hole where we're arguing about things and neither of us really know what we're talking about. Just say like, hey, time out. Neither of us know anything about nuclear fusion except what we learned in the Superman movie, which doesn't make us experts. So let's not fall down this rabbit hole where we're arguing about science when neither of us are scientists. And I think that just, again, observing those moments where you get off track and you feel like everybody's hardening, like, take a moment to say, time out. This is what I see happening here. And I don't think this is going to lead us anywhere productive. So I'm reading some of the questions.
No, I'm reading comments
I
too.
was just going to share that for the group. So I am writing a book on the history of the politics of climate change. And so I consider the history to sort of begin in 1965 when LBJ was first briefed on the greenhouse effect. 1965. Scientists came to him, said this is going to be a problem. He commissioned a study, because that's what you do in government, right? Somebody brings you a problem, you're like, okay, we're going to study it. And then, for more than 50 years, it's been study. But an interesting thing that I was reading today when I was doing a little research, not Al Gore's first hearing that he had, because there's like no record of it. I couldn't find a record online. There's no press on it. But the second hearing he held in 1982, he had a bunch of scientists up and he was trying to defend a program at DOE that was going to continue to study the problem that was on the budget chopping block. And his Republican counterpart was like, I feel like deja vu. We've been having these discussions. We know what we know, right? We know that this is a problem. These scientists all here are telling us it's a problem. Why do we have to keep studying it? And then the scientists are like, yeah, we know this is a problem. And so now we are comfortable with saying we have to do something. Nobody knew what to do. Point. And then by the time the policy caught up with like, what should we do? Then the agents of opposition had started to turn, big oil and starting to fund some of the disinformation and the casting doubt and stuff. So I just think that I thought that was so interesting when I was reading, where it was the conservative Republican who was saying, let's stop studying and start doing. And even Al Gore was saying, no, we really need to protect this budget to continue doing these studies.
I love it. Well, I love this. Go ahead, Beth.
I just wonder if it would be helpful to bring up more history like that and to talk more about where we've had success. The Clean Water Act is an enormous success story in our country's history, and took a lot of cooperation from people of different political stripes to enact and to implement. And it's like relatively recent history that we rarely discuss. And I think climate conversation, especially with people who are very progressive, can get so depressing because it can feel like extremely overwhelming and like we're too little too late no matter what we do. We have concrete examples of acting on climate issues that have worked really well. And I think if we could tell the success stories more often, there might be more momentum in these discussions too. I'm sorry, Sarah, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you're fine. Well, I wanted to say two things. One, to the point about the energy bills. I think you're right. I think everyone's understanding, even the conversations around inflation. I've been telling to people, like, energy is what's fueling inflation. Energy costs is a huge proportion of the consumer price index, and that's what's fueling some of the massive increase. And this is another place to illustrate, like, when we think we understand, like when we're in this spot, like, it'll never be enough. When we were beginning with solar panels and the projections of when they would be affordable and sustainable and actually help with energy costs was way far in the future. And they got out there and the market did its job, and like, bam, they're cheaper, they're working. I told someone this the other day when we were having this conversation about energy cost, I said, if you told me 5 years ago that I would have friends in Paducah, Kentucky with solar panels on their roof producing all their home's energy, I would have told you you were crazy. That seems so far in the future. And then all of a sudden, bam, here it is. Beth has them on her house. My friend Diane out in Melbourne, Kentucky. You guys, this is not San Francisco, okay? Has them on her house, producing her energy. If you told me I was going to be driving an electric car in 5 years, I would have told you you were crazy. And so I just think reminding people, like, it gets here faster than you think it is. Do not be discouraged by maybe what isn't currently available. And I think to Robert's point about basic science, I mean, this is where sometimes you just have to like give up with the sunk costs. Like, no, it's, as far as people who believe that humans and dinosaurs were here at the same time based on, their religious beliefs, like, you don't need them to change their minds about that to have a conversation about climate change now. Like, you just don't. Now you might want to, but it's not going to fuel any productive conversation. Sometimes you just have to let people believe what they want to believe about some things, because the cost to the relationship of convincing them otherwise, because then you're talking about really identity level beliefs. And that's why climate change has become difficult, because it is, and so often when it's tied up in partisanship, wrapped up in personal identity. And so I think sometimes you just have to pick your battles when it comes to this stuff. And like, where do I want to exert some influence? Do you want to exert some influence convincing them that dinosaurs did not live at the same time as humans? Or do you want to exert some influence convincing them that there might be some marketplace solutions to reduce the extreme weather events we are all experiencing?
And that's the thing. How can we be in problem solving mode, problem solution, trial, evaluation, refinement? I tell this story a lot. I grew up on a dairy farm in Western Kentucky, a small dairy farm. So my dad milked about 75 cows most of the time. And this was in the 90s when Al Gore was the vice president and was pushing forward probably a lot of the kinds of research that you were talking about, Chelsea. And I remember like it was yesterday when my dad learned that a new regulation required us to create a manure lagoon on our farm for 75 cows. And it was about $10,000. And that was a really scary number for our small family farm at the time, when the dairy industry was already really becoming difficult to sustain. And we did it, and it was gross and it smelled terrible all the time. And eventually we sold the cows, and there's the manure lagoon, and closing it is something that my family is still in the process of dealing with. And it's going to be about a $15,000 expense to get rid of it now. And we had a lot of conversation in my house about this. We all care deeply about the planet, and we all believe science and follow the studies and understand what a regulation like that was designed to do. And we also can see that imposing that kind of burden on a farm that was generating so little in terms of emissions versus targeting much, much larger operations where the burden of dealing with the emissions would be less in their overall economic picture. It didn't make any sense, right? And we don't have a ton of bitterness about that now. And we talk about this as a family, like they identified an emergency. They tried some things. We got hurt on the end of trying something. But you do have to try some things, and you do have to have some capacity for failure and for pain in the process, and some capacity for forgiveness and a willingness to say, what are you going to try next? And that's tough. But I really admire my parents for coming around to that place on this, where it was awful and scary and painful, and they understand what the government was trying to accomplish. And especially with the benefit of time, they're willing to say, that's okay that we get some things wrong occasionally.
You guys, I did not expect for Al Gore to play such a prominent role in the republicEn webinar, but here we are talking about him left and right. I mean, I guess it makes sense when you're having a conversation about climate and intractable conversations. I think this conversation about fear is really good. I think that often the role of fear in denying climate change is what I would call fear manifesting as skepticism. And skepticism of what you hear in the media is well placed. If you're, my mom's age, if you're in your late 60s, early 70s, you've had them tell you to be afraid of butter and eat margarine. You've had them tell you be afraid of margarine and eat butter. You've had people tell you that the world was going to end when the clock struck 1 on January 1st, 2000, because of the computers not knowing zeros from ones. I don't even remember what the argument was, but it was a big deal, right? So I think there's this, people adopt a narrative that the media is hyperbolic, and there is a negative bias in the media. And that's where a lot of the information about climate change is coming for so many people. You have a narrative that that politics is inherently corrupt and never a source of solution. And I think that so all that sort of distrust and skepticism, which I think fear underpins a lot of, finds fertile ground in a conversation about climate change. And so I think even the fact that the climate change conversation has been going on for so long, which we see and think, yeah, because the problem keeps getting worse, but you can easily, from a skeptical frame of mind, think, well, you keep talking about it, we're all still here. You can just hear these arguments in your head that people can put in place to support that sort of frame of mind. But I think it's that cynicism and that skepticism that just finds fertile ground. But I often think that is based in fear.
I think it's interesting, as someone who, considered myself conservative for a long time, just trying to reconcile the notion of being conservative, like this idea that we do want to make sure we're not throwing out traditions, make sure that we're not moving away too much from values that we hold dear, from a history that we're proud of. So where is the room for innovation in conservatism? And I that's a question that I would love to discuss with friends and family who hear climate change, and it's the change part that is the problem, right? And fear might be a little dramatic in some of these conversations, but annoyance, I'm not interested in this kind of guilt. I don't want to make this a priority. I have other things that I'm more interested in. I might ask in those discussions, like, where is the room for innovation? Like, are we allowed to follow current science on this? Are we allowed to change our thinking over time as we witness the impact of our atmosphere changing? I've heard many people say, like, well, the earth has been changing since the beginning of humanity. This is natural. It's just part of a natural progression. Okay. At what point are we allowed to respond to that in some way? Is there any role for us? Like, what is the philosophy at the heart of this? I don't want to assume that everyone is afraid of change, but I would like to understand the relationship between change and thinking of yourself as philosophically conservative.
Yeah. Does anybody have any other questions for us? Because the best way to talk about conversation is to be in conversation. Oh, Beth, did you plant Roger?
I didn't, but thank you, Roger. I am a nuclear power enthusiast, and this came through research. So I started working on a series about nuclear power for one of our premium podcasts, and I had no idea how I felt about it going into the research. And the more time I spent with it, and particularly in working on the episode about disasters, in looking at Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, in that episode, I thought, I don't see enough here to limit the potential of this avenue for us. I think there is lots to explore here. And these meltdowns were horrible, right? Just horrific consequence. But how do you measure that versus the daily horrific consequence that we're cumulatively creating through our use of fossil fuels? We don't tally up the disaster that we wreak every day on current human health and future human potential the way that we do with these disasters. So I really became convinced that nuclear power is a great way to move forward. And even as we witness, the fear around the nuclear plants in Ukraine, I don't think that fear is enough to keep us moving forward. I'm excited about the potential of nuclear fusion, but I think it's a real tragedy that we've had such a long period in the United States of writing nuclear out of the equation, when I think there is just enormous potential to solve some really vexing problems through it.
I wanted to answer Eleanor's question before it gets pushed up in the chat again. Eleanor, our podcast is mainly conversations between the two of us, and we are responding to news headlines and cultural conversations. Sometimes we are on opposing sides, but more, I would say it is differing perspectives than opposing. It's not a debate show. That's not what we do. We say we try to keep people informed and help process the news so that they leave empowered and not anxious. So there are conversations that we've had in the past where there were people who, definitely came from different perspectives and disagree with us, but I wouldn't say that that's the focus of our podcast.
And this is a good point, just to stay with nuclear, because I am kind of a nerd about this. Gwen's point about the waste is a good one. There are some really innovative solutions being explored, though, around what to do with the waste. European countries are much more pragmatic about this than we've been in the United States. There are basically tombs being constructed for nuclear waste and experiments being run about how long we can encase that waste until it's no longer dangerous for us. I just want that research to continue. I don't want to close the door on anything that has the kind of potential that I see around nuclear power.
And, the other thing I was thinking about, going back to our conversation really quickly about fear, this just occurred to me, is sometimes when we're worried that fear is fueling the other side, acknowledging your own fear can be a way to build trust and sort of open up a new path forward in the conversation, which I feel like is language I've used a lot for the course of this webinar, but I really think that's what we're trying to do. Again, we're not trying to convince each other. We're just trying to find a step forward, a small path forward. And so sometimes saying, I am afraid of this. These are the concerns I have. And acknowledging how you feel about this issue instead of just barraging people with stats and facts, and saying this is where I'm coming from emotionally, and this can build a lot of trust inside the conversation, because no matter how logical you think you're being, even the scientists at the nuclear fusion site, they are still bringing emotion to this, because we are social emotional creatures. And I think acknowledging that and building trust by sort of offering that up as a little vulnerability, as a way to share something inside the conversation, can always be helpful.
And to reduce people's assumptions. I mean, I feel very committed to concrete steps on climate, and I don't personally feel particularly alarmed about it. Some of that is a matter of just my personal value system, my timeline, my capacity to see into the timeline. I don't feel particularly alarmed. I feel a sense of responsibility, and that's what motivates me. And I think people who roll their eyes when you talk about climate change assume that if you care about it, you are sitting in dread all the time.
Yeah.
I think it's important to be sort of a joyful advocate around climate, and to tell people there are other motivators here than just fear or feeling despondent or wallowing in shame and guilt about what humanity has wrought.
I just want to say, not for nothing, this example of what we're doing is happening right now in the chat. Someone, I don't know who's the first name of this person, but they're just hey, I'd love an opportunity to talk with you about this further. I have personal experience with it. They're kind of on a different topic. And I thought, well, that's just a lovely example that doesn't happen in a lot of chats, because people feel like they have to barrage people with facts and data in their moment, instead of acknowledging that the best way is to share personal experiences. So y'all are already doing the workout. Y'all don't need us. You've already graduated. If this chat is any indication, I think that is really, really, really lovely. So I wanted to say too, Roger, I live in Paducah, Kentucky. West Paducah, Kentucky had a uranium enrichment plant for the 60s and 70s, most of the 80s. And so now we have an enormous amount of uranium waste. Bill Gates, supposedly, word on the street, is trying to figure out how we could use it, generate power from the waste stored at Paducah, Kentucky, and then Paducah, Kentucky can like power the entire United States, which excites me as a citizen of Paducah, obviously. But it's a conversation we've had in our community because we have that waste present. It's nothing like Yucca Mountain, but we do have it here, and that is the uranium enrichment process, the building of the plant, the tearing down of the plant is closed, but the process to close the plant and deal with this waste is like 40 to 50 years. Like it's an incredibly long process. And I think I feel like that timeline of nuclear is also what intimidates people so much when they talk about it. And I think that's true of climate. Like we're just talking about a very long timeline. It's a timeline that's hard for people to process.
And I think timelines are hard. This issue came up the other day when my dad was talking about the Montreal Protocol, which for those who don't know, was the international agreement that began and succeeded in phasing out chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs in aerosols, refrigerants, and a major greenhouse gas that was causing the depletion in the ozone layer. And it was in the news about a week ago because they said, we're on target to fix the ozone. It'll be fixed in 40 years. And of course, Sarah, you were saying your 13-year-old, like everything's doom and gloom, nothing's fast enough. And my 18-year-old was like, 40 years, they're excited about that now. And my dad, who sort of has lived through that whole thing, was like, this is so great. So I think your perspective is different depending on where you are in your life and what you've experienced.
Well, and I just want to say too, I always think about this. I was telling my son about this the other day. You know, we used to power our lanterns with whale oil back in the long ago days, way longer than 40 years ago, obviously. And right about the time that we killed all the whales for whale oil, we figured out electricity. Nicolette, my husband, is always like, that is not as hopeful a story as you want it to be. I'm like, yes, it is. Yes, it is. Yes, we get to the wire. We push it to the wire. We are humans. We are not good with long-term consequences. I'm sorry. It served us as, a species for thousands of years, and we're not going to turn that corner quickly. But at a certain point, we look around and go, oh, no, wait. And then once we get to that point, we are very quick and very innovative. I mean, and I just think like we have done this. It's a pattern of behavior. I'm not saying it's a positive pattern of behavior. I'm just saying it is a pattern of behavior. And I think but those long timelines, they're hard for us. It's okay. We're good at other things, like nuclear fusion, apparently.
Speaking of timelines, I just want to point out that we only have a few minutes left. So I want to give Sarah and Beth the opportunity to offer some closing thoughts. And if there's, any one last burning question, or maybe you should also let I was going to say listeners, this is not a podcast, Chelsea. They're not even really viewers. Our guests tonight know how to find you guys.
Well, thank you so much for having us, and thank you for all of your engagement with us in the chat. That is always the fun part of doing these events for us. We love hearing what's on people's minds and hearts. So thank you for that. I think that the sense of optimism that we've been discussing and that Sarah tells in her whale story is maybe the most important fuel that you can have going forward. If you remain optimistic, people will want to be influenced by you. The gloom and doom is not contagious the way that optimism is. So thank you for all the work that you're doing out there to influence your legislators and your fellow citizens. And we would love to have you all stay in touch with us. Our podcast is Pantsuit Politics. It's available wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can really connect with all of the different kinds of work that we do through our website, which is pantsuitpoliticsshow.com.
Yes, thank you so much for having us. This was such a lovely event. I think people who are really invested, we say all the time on Pantsuit Politics that you have to know what your work is to do in the world, and that it's tempting to feel overwhelmed and feel like everything's a problem. You have to pay attention to everything. But the best civic conversations, the best civic momentum is found among people who know their work to do in the world. And republicEn knows its work to do in the world, and you're doing a great job. So thanks for having us.
Well, thank you. This has been a dream come true, but it was luckily not the dream I had last night coming true, which I'm not hear about. And
Involved a lot of pillows. We're not sure, guys.
Anyway, thanks to everyone who tuned in, and thanks to our wonderful guests, Sarah and Beth. And I hope you found some new listeners to your show. I'll be continuing my advocacy and my thinking of you guys as my friends when I talk to people in my life. So
Thank you so much.